Maybe we'll just give it a couple more minutes, because I think a few people have just popped off to have a little leg stretch. And then you can take it away.
Oh, perfect.
Okay, thank you, Raven.
No problem. Is this going to be recorded, by the way? Just is this whole session?
Yeah, it's been recorded at the moment. So what we do every week is we record, and then anyone who can't make the session or anyone who wants to watch or listen back can look again. So, because obviously, I think depending on where you are, there's some of the internet connections have can be a bit problematic, but at least this means that the whole thing's recorded. So,
Definitely.
yeah. Okay, cool, great.
Perfect. I think that I'll start, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, and I'll try and bounce back between them all. Welcome. My name is Raven, and I'll be doing the peer review session for you today. And I think this is just going to be a really informal chat about kind of demystifying what a crit or peer review is, and sort of to allow for new definitions and resources and new ways of you all to self-reflect together as a group in terms of your individual projects and group projects more particularly. So I'll just go ahead and start, and I'll just do a little bit of an introduction of myself. So I'm training to be an associate lecturer. I'm a Chelsea graduate, and I'm also the junior editor for Shades of Noir. And I am also, within that, a digital sculptor. So I look at figurative work, and I do a lot of things digitally. So that is just a tiny bit about my background. So here's some examples of my work. Some of you may have seen it, some of you may have not. And it's just kind of how I think a lot about people and conversations, particularly within my practice, and I hope that that comes out in my teaching. So those are examples of my work. This is the latest example of my work, which was a collaboration I did with Canary Wharf, for anyone who's interested. So particularly for this session, which is going to be around 25 minutes to half an hour, we hope, we're going to go through objectives of peer reviews and crits. We're going to go through some netiquette just for everyone, looking at key terms actually, because there's kind of a difference between criticism and critique. So I want to just go through that with everyone, looking at ways of good practice as well, any conventions of the peer review and crits, and finally outcomes. So I'll jump ahead, and we'll just talk about some of the potential objectives for today's session. No audio. Can everyone hear me? Can you put your thumb up if you can't hear me? Can you hear me, everyone? Yes. Okay, perfect. Perfect. So the objective of today's session is to get some guidelines, some tips really about peer review and what that actually is and what you'll be doing in a peer review session. And this is actually really useful in terms of group collaboration. It's really good that everyone is able to talk to one another and really successfully critique each other's work. Also to gain some critical feedback for your own projects in order to advance those and progress those further as well, to further contextualize your own content with emphasis on both experimentation and professionalism. Also to develop a better understanding and appreciation for your own personal practice, and finally to understand the importance of the key concepts of conventions in particular. So I think just before we start, I think in terms of just virtual learning etiquette, as ever, if you can turn your phones off, just if we get any background noise as well as microphones, but feel free if you want to say anything or ask a question, please do drop it in the chat or put your hand up and I will try and bounce between the two in order to answer any questions that anyone may have. And there might also be time at the end of the session to do that as well. Of course, if you need to go to the bathroom and if you need to drop in and out, feel free to. You don't have to let anyone know. It's completely your own prerogative. And also just kind of remembering that although we are all behind screens, that this is a professional environment. So, try not to talk over anyone should anyone want to enter into the conversation. And also please make use of the chat function, which I can see. So I'll be just bouncing between the two. And also just really mutual respect for everyone that's participating presently would be really helpful. Okay, so I think initially I want to start with the glossary of key terms. I think for me, who comes from a fine art background, there's a difference, I think, in defining what a crit is against a peer review. So I think it's really helpful for us all to have a similar understanding of where I'm coming from when we talk about a peer review. So this actually is a list of keywords that I found on Moodle, which everyone can access, and I think it's really good for you guys to go through it just to understand actually there's slightly different terms of definitions related to assessment and practice and peer review particularly. There's about 14 pages, so it might take you a while to read through, but I think some are really relevant to this particular part of your unit. So for me, I call it a crit, but I understand for fashion journalism it's called a peer review, and this is where your work is peer reviewed in a group setting, and that's the emphasis is on group. They provide an invaluable form of appraisal, as you've received not only individual feedback, but collective feedback. And in that way, you can learn by means of discussion that centers around your own work and members of the group. And I think definitely this is something that we benefit from in an art field because, there are so many different ways of doing the same thing. And I think in you all seeing what each other are doing and recognizing, I guess, the power in kind of doing things differently as well, I think it can only ever enrich your work. Now for critique and criticism, which actually are interchangeable but are not the same thing. So criticism particularly is analysis and judgment of the merits or faults of an object or idea, or as more people would probably initially find, criticism is a negative expression of disapproval. I think in terms of peer review, we try to stay away from the idea of criticism, and I prefer personally, and I think a lot of people prefer the word critique, which is listed below, and that is actually a detailed analysis and assessment of something in order to evaluate in an analytical way. And so, as you can see, whilst both are a form of analysis, there's a different emphasis on what actually are your responses to that particular object. Where criticism can be received and more generally is received negatively, critique is more a way of constructively posing questions or answers, and it actually gives the recipient more opportunities to respond and also to perform their own solo research. So I would definitely encourage you all to ask questions, but be mindful about the types of terminology you use, which can move your comment from them to critique. Just to continue on as well, this is all a form of feedback. And so, you get guidance from your tutors, and I think it's really important that your peers also do the same. And it can be done in a number of ways. So as we're all now operating in a virtual realm, this is normally going to be verbally done, whether through technology or not. And then everyone else is more conventionally used to doing it either written or it's graded as either a formative or summative assessment. Similarly, you're all working in groups, so this relates to collaboration or collaborative projects, which provides you with an opportunity to work with other students and within industry also. And that just gives you a chance to really just see how others do things and kind of to have to negotiate that space, because undoubtedly when you go into the field of journalism, you're going to have to be negotiating a lot of different opinions about the same thing. And so it's really good, I think, really early on to just understand the differences in perspectives and how that enrich your own process. And finally, I wanted to add one in, and I'm not sure if anyone's heard of it, but it's called autoethnography. And this is actually a form of qualitative research that uses the author or the maker, if you want to put it in another word, as a form of self-reflection to explore their own personal experiences and interests. So I think in adding autoethnography to the session. I think it's really important that whatever you do, whether it's solo or collaborative, making sure that you just bring, I guess, that part of yourself into it, because I think that will enrich your experience, but it will also show others where you're coming from and your own perspective. And I think that's really valuable for any work that you do in the future. Okay, so good practice. I think my initial thought when I was designing this slide is what is good practice, and what are the peer review or crit conventions. I think it's important to note that in the first instance that you as a group define your own group good practice. There is no formula in which to do a peer review or a crit. There are maybe a set of conventions which are really helpful, but again, these are all really specially designed spaces that I think you as students have complete control in and can really just adapt the space in how you best see your work and how you best want to receive your responses. So key to this approach is making allowances for and facilitating the demonstration of different intersectional and neurodiverse approaches to inquiry. So intersectionality relates to kind of the mix of your own race, culture, religion, anything that really makes up who you are, alongside neurodiverse approaches, which is related to if maybe you suffer from dyslexia like I do, or if you have a disability or impairment, just making sure that those methods of inquiry are included and thought about within your own sessions. And presentations particularly, and also aligning this with autoethnography again, which can just be nurtured in the space, and so it just allows space for everyone to feel included when you're having a peer review. Please understand that there should be no presupposed understanding to what a crit space is. I think particularly within the fine art field, which I grew up in, there was always this understanding that we all knew what a crit is. But I think the older I got, the more I realized how tailored that space is, and that it can be a space for everyone, a very inclusive space particularly. But there's no presupposed understanding that you need to have when you enter into that space as well. Also, I think key to the good practices is agency and action for everyone, and using critical pedagogy, and you can do some further research on that, but that is really just a way of making sure that you have your own agency and you have your own voice to speak and to express yourself within collective spaces such as a crit or a peer review. And finally, just for the duty of care as well, recognizing your own individual responsibilities to yourself and to other students, and recognizing your role as a participant within that space. I think it's really valuable that we all recognize our own positions within the space and how it impacts upon others. And I think just making sure that we all, tutors included, hold a duty of care for one another, I think it can really be a very beneficial space in terms of getting feedback for your presentations. So these are just some of the conventions that I have kind of stumbled upon in my many years of doing art. And I think they just really help to kind of create a very rounded space, and really get the best out of all participants. And so, of course, we start with negotiable house rules. So much like I began this presentation, just really outline sort of the expectations of everyone in the group. Sometimes, and it has done for me, it has gone a bit awry. So just making sure that everyone understands the focus of the peer review and what is expected of them, I think is really important. I mean, and also understanding that these are negotiable and they're not mandatory, but it would be useful if everyone followed the same rules. Again, duty of care, which relates to flexibility, compassion, mutual support for one another, and interrogation as standard. And that really just relates to your position again within it, and making sure that, whatever someone's perspective is or the things that they're looking at, please be flexible and understanding and compassionate and understanding that it may not be your experience, but that it is theirs and it is valuable. And as it relates to autoethnography, just being really careful about how you broach, I guess, something that is important to someone else if it is not a core concern of your own. I think within this, you should always ask really, really clear questions. So, when trying to, I guess, offer some sort of critique, make sure that you're direct. I think a lot of confusion happens when people are trying to say something and they're not quite saying it right. I think just be prepared to just say things very blankly but again, compassionately. And I think that will always help the recipient in responding, in particular if you're asking a question about something they've presented. In terms of outcomes, I think that in offering responses, you should always try to offer resources more than pose questions. And I think that is just to allow the recipient to conduct their own solo research. So, whilst it's all good offering a question, why not offer them a resource which